You see this? The VRChat devs took foveated rendering from us, but now we can get it back, and the performance improvements look rather nice here. Well, if the title and that intro wasn't enough to clue you in, I've got something rather special today to look at. Back before the EAC update, a lot of people use various mods for VRChat, and one of them was foveated rendering. Because due to the user-created nature of VRChat and many people not knowing the meaning of restraint or optimization, it can be an incredibly demanding game, and stuff like foveated rendering can help with performance. I covered foveated rendering more in my most recent video. Go check that out if you want a little more in-depth and general look at it. But to touch on the important point of what it is, it's essentially the idea of lowering the level of detail in your peripheral of your view while maintaining the full level of detail where your eyes are looking and focusing on, thereby saving performance. It works on a similar principle as our own eyes do, since you only see full resolution, so to speak, in a rather tiny area of your vision. And we're going to be taking a look at today in VRChat, specifically dynamic foveated rendering, or DFR, which uses eye tracking in order to change the focus area based on where your eye's looking, ensuring that you'll always get a sharp image and the full level of detail compared to fixed foveated rendering, or FFR, which is a static and unchanging in the corners of your FOV. But before we get to the benchmarking, I have to explain a little about this program, how it's used, and a few things to keep in mind, because there are some asterisks here. Firstly, the program is called Pimax Magic Loader and was made by Mbusha, whose work you may recognize from something popular like the OpenXR Toolkit. What this does is allow Pimax's foveated rendering to be used with games that have EAC, where it normally fails to work. But the big example of this is obviously VRChat, and that's why it's the focus today. At the moment, this only works with Pimax HMDs, but I believe Mbusha is working on adding DFR support for the Arrow and then FFR for the Quest device. You will also need an RTX graphics card from NVIDIA or a 16XX GTX series in order to use this. AMD just doesn't support the way foveated rendering is done here outside DirectX 12, and VRChat is not DirectX 12. And that's not going to change. It's a problem on their end. Also, this is probably not public at the time of this video, but it should go public not long afterwards. I'll have a link in the description once it is up for public download. Secondly, there's instructions on how to install it on the page. I'll briefly show them on screen. These may change slightly by the public release, but you should get the general idea. It's pretty simple. But thirdly, we have to address the elephant in the room that I'm sure has been on everyone's mind as soon as it started. Is this safe to use? Well, unless the devs officially weigh in, I technically cannot 100% say you are perfectly fine with zero risk of anything, but at the same time, this is working through SteamVR mainly, and you could perhaps compare it to something more like Reshade. Reshade is something which EAC does play nicely with and even allows it in most games because it's benign and well known, even if it is modifying visuals and doing things like this does. You can even use the system-wide version of Open Composite with VRChat via the same method, as long as you have your own digital signature, which Open Composite does not by default. Then EAC is happy because of this and will not give you any issues. And Mbusha has made his other tools work with other games via EAC and has not run into any issues at any point with them. Neither have I using them, neither have many people. Because EAC sees this as a safe thing due to the digital signature helping verify security and already allows certain tools, again, like Reshade, and EAC doesn't moderate, it'll simply kick you off the servers or prevent you from getting on if it detects something's wrong, at least generally. And then there's also the fact that VRChat did once support NVIDIA's VRSS, which this works very similarly to. Basically, I'd say if you trust something like Reshade or Open Composite already, then you probably can trust this, but it is up to user discretion at the end of the day unless the developers officially comment. Now, with the disclaimers out of the way, here's the test configuration and methodology being used today. I have an RTX 4090, 7950X3D, 6000 MHz CL30 DDR5 RAM, and them running with the Pimax Crystal at 4312 by 5100 per eye, 1.0 res in the Pimax client. Settings-wise, I am running everything maxed out in VRChat except MSAA, which I have disabled disabled entirely. I also have particle limiter checked, and while I have no maximum limit to the number of avatars loaded, I do have culling enabled past 31 meters. I also tested on max. So editors know, it was just discovered that Pimax made a mistake in their UI, and for the foveated rendering section, the highest setting, maximum, was actually the lowest setting, while the lowest one was actually the highest. They got flipped somehow. Only found this after I recorded and edited almost everything, and I don't have time to redo it all, so I'm actually testing on the lowest setting here. Highest setting seems to provide another plus 10 to 20%-ish GPU performance over the lowest one in a good case. Maybe I'll do a revisit comparing every setting at some point if there's demand. I also had 0 safety settings enabled on top of all this because I have the best CPU and GPU in the world for VRChat, so why not? Methodology-wise, because VRChat is hard to benchmark for real-world use case and how fumbling around toggling DFR on and off with the headset on and not opening the Steam VR menu, which would mess with the ongoing FPS overlay, isn't easy, I had to get a bit creative here with two main kinds of tests. For the first one, I started with a few synthetic benchmarks of going into some heavier worlds I could find, or were recommended, solo, and then did a quick side-by-side comparison, with DFR on and off for a minute or two. Secondly, to try and get some actual real-world data, I went into various worlds and public lobbies of sizes ranging from about 10 to 80 people. I then found a spot with a good chunk of people and or some mirrors, and then spent a little bit of time toggling between DFR on and off while checking for any notable FPS changes. Since due to the constantly changing nature of large lobbies especially, running an identical benchmark just isn't really possible without two identical systems, and I am nowhere near rich enough for that. Please also bear in mind CPU spikes occur often when a new avatar loads into these lobbies, not DFR's fault. Thirdly, due to VRChat hammering the CPU and GPU quite heavily, I will be listing the frame timings for both alongside the average FPS I actually got to help illustrate between being CPU and GPU bound, at least for where I could do a proper side-by-side. And with frame times, lower is better, because it means your system is delivering those frames quicker, thus higher FPS. As an example, if the CPU has higher frame times than the GPU, that likely indicates a CPU bottleneck. Whereas if the GPU's got higher frame times, that likely indicates a GPU bind. Please also bear in mind the about 10 to 15% recording penalty on the GPU performance here. Now, all of this out of the way, let's take a look at the first set of benchmarks. To kick things off, we have the world Noir Lost Arts, which saw one of the greatest uplifts on the 4090. With DFR, we saw an increase of around plus 38% on average FPS, with the 1% lows rising almost proportionately, but the 0.1% lows only improved by about 22%. Still, even though my FPS is still low, this improvement is tremendous. One thing to note though is that there was a slight increase in CPU load and frame times on the averages and 1% lows. The absolute frame times were still low and we are still incredibly far from being CPU bound, but the relative increase on those two was somewhat high, around 29 and 21%. Conversely, the 0.1% lows were almost 35% better. While this is not a problem in this world, something about how Pimax handles DFR does occasionally hit the CPU a bit, and those of you who are VRChat veterans may already be worried about this. However, we do need to talk a little more about it as it's nowhere near universal. To illustrate the point, I went to the Udon benchmark world and loaded 80 avatars with constraints enabled. This made me solidly CPU bound, and take note of two important things here. Unlike the previous world, DFR had virtually zero impact on my frame times. The 0.1% lows changed, but that's within run-to-run variance. The other two metrics were identical. Secondly, take note of my actual FPS. It doesn't change. This form of foveated rendering only improves your GPU performance. So if your CPU is the bottleneck, you're not going to actually gain anything. My GPU frame times, average and lows, all improved by around 18%. But because my GPU is not the limiting factor, even that sizable improvement doesn't change the experience. If we had an even better CPU to make us GPU bound instead though, then DFR would be improving things. But you can't get better at this time. This is one of two ways that your GPU can react to a CPU bind, but we're going to take a look at the other way a little bit later. And here we have Recuerdos del Olvido. This world had an example of causing both a huge change in CPU and GPU load. This saw another rather large boost of around plus 36% performance, with the lows rising just a few percent behind proportionately. The difference here of around 60 to almost 90 FPS feels tremendous in VR. And yes, this is a bit of a chiller asleep world, but unless you are asleep, no matter what you're doing, it's going to feel like a better experience if you're even a little bit sensitive to FPS from having such a big boost. However, I must point out the CPU frame times. Look at how they have literally almost doubled with DFR enabled. It is not a problem for me because I am on the toppest tier CPU you can get, but the fact CPU frame time shot up this much is cause for concern, because if you loaded a couple people into this with badly optimized avatars or on a much lower end CPU, if you saw that kind of increase on something lower end, it could potentially blunt some of the gains from DFR. Still, my CPU frame times would need to go up by almost another 80% from where they are right now to start becoming CPU bad. But this is the first sign that you may want to keep FPS VR handy if using DFR in VRChat. Let's take a look at a worst case scenario for this CPU increase though. So here we are in Cyberpunk 2076, and oh my goodness, look at these results! We were already lightly CPU bound without DFR, but we were still getting just under 100 FPS, which is great! But toggling DFR on, our CPU frame times spike up by literally around 2.5x, and our actual FPS drops all the way down to the low 40s. This is the worst instance of strange CPU behavior and highest relative spike I have seen testing any foveated rendering ever. I have no way to explain it, and this is why you'll want to monitor FPS VR if you choose to use foveated rendering in VRChat. But there's more to this, and I have to get technical briefly. One possible reason you may see GPU frame times also going up is that the GPU is spending so long waiting for the CPU to complete its workload that frame times are increasing, as this is another response to a bottleneck that's possible. You can see that the GPU temperature and utilization is way down though, indicating it's not working very hard. However, this is not all. These results were so out of the ordinary from any test that I had to validate them on another tool and double check them to be sure. Using MSI Afterburner's overlay to look at per core utilization, I found something odd here. With DFR enabled, it appears that the overall core utilization, we're looking at cores 1 to 16 here since VRChat has affinity mass to that, goes down, but some individual cores get far more heavily pinged, particularly core 9 here. However, that still doesn't really explain the utterly drastic drop in performance, and the numbers don't really add up. This is not as simple as just CPU load explodes. Unfortunately, without having access to the actual code to look at exactly how it works and it is interacting with VRChat, and I'm also not a game developer to really dig deep into that stuff, it's harder to look too far into it because there must be something in the rendering pipeline that is hitting a massive snag somewhere and holding up performance, likely going beyond just the simpler metrics that we can read from these tools. And I couldn't use presentmon to check GPU busy because of EAC. But there seems to be something here with the CPU, since a while back I asked Pimax about CPU load increase with DFR, and it sounded like a degree of uplift was expected, but not like this. I've been talking with the dev of Pimax Magic Loader, Mbusha, about this, and he's looking into it. Has some possible theories on how to fix this because of other implementations of foveated rendering I've seen haven't really had this extreme of behavior. If this is fixed after the video goes public, then I will have a pinned comment saying such, or have an updated video. But there also is a possibility this just could be the nature of dealing with injection-based foveated rendering, since it's not a natively supported thing in the app. But until then, the end result is DFR was a terrible idea here, and you want to keep FPS VR handy. And as the CPU frame times on FPS VR seem to give the best general idea of this happening to the end user or not, I will still be referencing them because it's a quick way to determine if DFR is helpful or not at a glance. Moving on to the lobbies, this was in the Backrooms v10.0.4 with only 10 people, 5 of which were in front of me. Without DFR, we're hovering around 95 FPS and GPU bound. CPU frame times are roughly 2.5 milliseconds or so, give or take a little bit. But toggling on DFR, I get a sizable increase of over plus 20% and am nearly at 120 FPS. I'd be refresh rate capped if I were not recording. My CPU frame times did increase from 2.5 to around 4 milliseconds though. A plus 60% relative increase is quite high, but we're far from being CPU bound, and even if my CPU frame times doubled again, I would still be in the triple digit FPS range despite a CPU bottleneck. Foveation was a pretty nice and good benefit here. Scaling up a bit, we have Just Be Club with a 20-person lobby, with about 12 of them here with a mirror. With foveated rendering on, I'm getting around 68 FPS, but I am suffering a slight CPU bind since my frame times are greater on it. Toggling it off, my CPU frame times go way down, but are still quite spiky. I also went down to around 64 FPS doing this, so I am technically getting extra performance here, but it's only about plus 8 to 9%. And if I had a worse CPU, even that could go away. Still, foveated rendering was beneficial here, even in a mid-sized and little bit heavier lobby. Going to a 25-person Black Cat lobby, and the biggest cluster of about a dozen here. With DFR off, I'm getting low 80s on FPS, but with some very notable spike, and about 5.8 milliseconds CPU frame times, but again, they're also somewhat spiky. Toggling DFR on, my FPS jumps to around low 90, getting about plus 12% or so, but CPU frame times are about 9 milliseconds with some spikes, and I have a slight CPU bottleneck. Gaining about plus 10 FPS is quite nice. Even though I've gone from GPU to CPU bound, I have gained FPS. And now I have two tests with the Midnight Rooftop, as I observed a little interesting behavior here in this world. Firstly, I joined a 40-person lobby, with the majority of them being on the roof here. Without DFR, I'm only getting around 29 FPS. CPU frame times are around 9 milliseconds or so. So we are very GPU bound. Enabling DFR, my FPS jumps to about 34, which is still low, but plus 17% performance is nice. Even briefly hits high as 37. But my CPU frame times are kind of around 12 to 13 milliseconds. So we still saw a notable increase of a bit under plus 40% there, but we remain incredibly GPU bound considering our frame times there are over 2 times worse. And this was one of the smaller relative increases seen. For curiosity's sake, and just to see if it was maybe that area of the world, I went to another lobby of around 35 people, with a bit under half of them in front of the mirror here. Without DFR, I got around 55 FPS and was GPU bound, with CPU frame times of around 6.7 milliseconds. But toggling DFR, I shot up to around 65 FPS, an 18% improvement, while my CPU shot up to around 9.2 milliseconds, though it was a bit spiky, so the lows may have been worse. But still, this was quite a good increase while being far from CPU bound, and a small relative CPU increase as well, even in another spot. So it just seems like this world responds quite well to DFR. And just because I could, and I saw an instance for it, I joined an 80-person lobby in the Great Pug. And this one's kind of hard to pin down. So I am obviously CPU bound, but toggling between DFR off and on, it didn't appear to produce significantly worse CPU frame times as far as I could tell, and my GPU frame times went from a solid red line to having some yellow in them. But my system is being so overwhelmed with so much happening and everything changing, frame times are jumping around quite noticeably. There was perhaps a slight difference in lower CPU frame times without it, but it's so close and there's so many people moving around or changing avatars, I'm hesitant to solidly say it's from DFR. Way too many variables when I'm under this heavy a load and this many people in a lobby. But it's not causing an obviously huge detriment, so I mean, I guess that's what you want to see if you're CPU bound with DFR. So, with the benchmarks done, let's talk about some general takeaways, because the answer to should you use this is kinda complicated. Foveated rendering, or at least this implementation of it, is not a set it and forget it deal with VRChat. There are instances where you get a truly massive performance spike on the CPU that can blunt the gains you get from it, to even cause significant performance regression. However, at the same time, there are instances where you can see some truly massive gains on FPS and GPU performance. And bear in mind, this is on a 4090, which if you check my dedicated foveated rendering video, often saw lower gains from this than the comparatively far weaker 3080 Ti mobile, which I may do a dedicated video on covering DFR and VRChat if there is demand. You may even see more gains on lower end GPUs. But what happens happens to the CPU, whatever's going on there, it's just so inconsistent. There generally seems to be at least mild impact, but it can range from basically nothing to your frame rates literally cut in half. Though that extreme an instance is rare, as I did check a handful of other worlds beyond just those features in the video within the trending tab, and I didn't see it occur in any of them. It is important to note that even if you become CPU bound instead of GPU bound enabling it though, it is still possible to get higher FPS with foveation than without if the bottleneck is not too bad. We saw a case of that. However, this begs the question, when should you use this? Well, due to the user-created nature of VRChat, I can only give some general guidelines and with how variable things can be. I'd say that this seems most beneficial to use in small to medium-sized lobbies, though, depending on your hardware, of course. In those, and assuming you're not in a world which just murders the CPU by default like the Cyberpunk one, you might have a much better experience enabling foveation. But keep FPS VR handy, as you really may want to turn it off sometimes, particularly in bigger lobbies where you're CPU bound anyway. If you have a really bad CPU though, it just might not be worth it. We'll see if the problems relating to that get fixed at some point, or maybe VRChat will add some native support. This all said, VRChat is currently moving toward a new, much more modern version of Unity. This may potentially bring some big changes, hopefully good ones. So I will do a revisit of that when it's out of the beta phase and see if maybe anything's changed. I may even have an updated video in the comments or description if you are watching this at some point far in the future. And there you have it. Are you going to use this in VRChat, or are you worried about the CPU performance? If you like the video, do let me know, and consider sticking around to see what I do next. If you don't, well, then thanks for stopping by either way and making it to the end, and I will see you again sometime maybe. Later.